Landon, a 22-year-old black man from Detroit, had finally landed a job he desperately needed at a prestigious restaurant downtown. Although he had been trained at a reputable culinary school, he found the industry tough to break into, especially in high-end establishments. His culinary talent was undeniable, but he faced one rejection after another, always feeling that his race and background were shadowing his abilities. Finally, he received a job offer to work as an assistant to one of the top chefs in the city, Chef Robert. Known for his intensity and strict standards, Chef Robert ran his kitchen with an iron fist. From the moment Landon stepped through the doors of La Maison Étoilée, he felt eyes on him, but he steeled himself against it. This was a chance to prove himself, regardless of how hard it might be. As Landon introduced himself to Chef Robert, he noticed a slight sneer on the chef's face. The chef looked him up and down as if assessing a piece of cheap produce. "Well," Chef Robert started with an air of dismissal, "you're here to help, not hinder. Don't touch anything unless I tell you, and keep your station spotless. The last thing I need is a distraction." He turned away without another word, leaving Landon standing there, awkward and embarrassed. It was clear from day one that Landon was at the bottom of the totem pole. His colleagues, mostly white, were barely friendly. They whispered among themselves whenever he passed by, casting curious glances but never offering genuine conversation. Every mistake he made, no matter how small, was met with pointed critiques from Chef Robert, while his peers' errors were often overlooked or brushed aside. One afternoon, Landon overheard Chef Robert speaking with the manager. "I don't understand why we're even hiring people like him," Robert muttered under his breath. "This place has a reputation to uphold." Landon felt his stomach twist, but he knew he had to keep pushing forward. He had bills to pay, dreams to chase, and people to prove wrong. He poured himself into his work, perfecting his knife skills, organizing ingredients, and following every instruction precisely. A few weeks later, the restaurant hosted an event for a high-profile client, a prominent figure in the culinary world who remained unnamed until the night of the event. Rumor had it that a famous food critic would also attend. The staff was on high alert, each one tense and eager to avoid any mistakes. Landon had been assigned to prepare a selection of appetizers under Chef Robert's watchful eye. He moved efficiently, chopping, mixing, and arranging delicate hors d'oeuvres with precision. But as the time grew closer, Chef Robert began hovering over him, his critical gaze making Landon's hands shake. Just as Landon was placing the final touches on a dish, Chef Robert leaned in, inspecting it with a frown. He muttered something about sloppy work and untrained hands, then picked up the dish and slammed it on the counter, scattering the contents. "Do it again," he barked, eyes flashing. "This is not a fast food joint, Landon. We have standards here." Landon took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, but he could feel his cheeks burning. As he picked up the broken pieces and prepared to redo the dish, one of the sous chefs smirked, clearly enjoying the scene. "Guess they don't teach finesse where you're from," the sous chef sneered, just loud enough for Landon to hear. That night, Landon went home exhausted and emotionally drained, but he was determined not to let their behavior break him. Instead, he practiced relentlessly, working on his techniques late into the night, driven by the need to prove that he belonged in this world. The following week, the restaurant was abuzz with anticipation for a very special guest who had made a last-minute reservation. No one was allowed to know the guest's identity until they arrived. Even Chef Robert seemed nervous, barking orders with extra intensity, his usual arrogance replaced with unusual tension. When the guest finally walked in, Landon was in the back, busy preparing ingredients. But he heard gasps ripple through the staff. Curious, he peered out from the kitchen door and froze. There, sitting at the best table in the house, was his grandfather. Not just any grandfather. Landon's grandfather was a highly respected retired chef who had won numerous awards, a trailblazer who had shattered many racial barriers in the culinary world back in the 70s. He was a legend in the industry, and even though he had stepped away from the spotlight, his name still carried weight. Landon's heart raced. His grandfather had come to see him. As Chef Robert approached the table to introduce himself, he didn't seem to recognize the elderly man. However, his polite demeanor changed when Landon's grandfather introduced himself, his voice as smooth and commanding as ever. Ah, I've heard so much about your establishment, Chef Robert. I thought I'd see if it lives up to the reputation. Chef Robert's face turned pale, and he stammered out a greeting, clearly aware of who this man was. His arrogance wavered, and for the first time his voice was filled with respect, almost fear. Landon watched from the kitchen door, a mixture of pride and amusement swirling within him. When the food began to arrive, Chef Robert took extra care to ensure that every plate was flawless. But then the unexpected happened. As Landon's grandfather tasted one of the appetizers, he paused, his expression unreadable. "This dish," he said thoughtfully, "tastes familiar, but something is missing." Chef Robert's face fell, and he began to apologize profusely. But Landon's grandfather raised a hand to silence him. "It's missing heart. It's missing the touch of someone who knows the story behind the ingredients, who respects where the food came from." His gaze drifted to the kitchen door where Landon was standing, hidden in the shadows. Chef Robert followed the line of his sight, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Landon. But before he could react, Landon's grandfather continued, "May I have a word with the young man preparing these dishes? I believe I know the touch of his work." Chef Robert's face was a mask of confusion and embarrassment, but he nodded stiffly, gesturing for Landon to step forward. Landon felt his heart pounding as he walked toward the table, his grandfather's proud gaze fixed on him. He had never expected his grandfather to appear in his workplace, much less request him by name. He could feel the stares of his colleagues, their shock and confusion evident. And for the first time, Landon felt the weight of his identity, not as an outsider in a world that dismissed him, but as someone worthy, someone seen. Landon entered Chef Robert's office, unsure of what to expect, but feeling the shift in the chef's demeanor. Robert, no longer able to hide his discomfort, sat behind his desk, eyes piercing as they fixed on Landon. "Sit down," Robert commanded, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Landon took a seat, meeting his gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated. The two sat in silence for a moment, tension thick in the air. "You're related to him, aren't you?" Chef Robert finally asked, his voice low. "Yes, he's my grandfather," Landon replied, his tone steady. Chef Robert exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Do you realize the responsibility you carry with that kind of legacy?" Landon didn't flinch. "I do. It's why I push myself every day, why I'm here despite the challenges." Robert's face darkened at the hint of accusation. "Challenges," he repeated. "You think you're the only one who's had to fight to get where you are?" "Maybe not," Landon replied, his voice unwavering. "But I'm certainly the only one here whose work is constantly scrutinized just for existing." The chef's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. Instead, he sat back, a calculating expression crossing his face. "Fine," he said at last. "If you want to prove yourself so badly, then let's see if you can handle it. Tomorrow night, we're hosting a private event, a 7-course tasting menu. I'll let you oversee the appetizers. See if you can match the standards we're known for." Landon's heart pounded. He'd been hoping for a chance like this, but he knew Chef Robert wasn't offering it out of goodwill. It was a test, a setup to see if he'd buckle under pressure. But Landon was ready. He nodded, holding Robert's gaze. "I accept." The next morning, Landon arrived at the restaurant before dawn. He spent hours meticulously preparing ingredients, tasting each component to ensure balance, seasoning, and presentation. The sous chefs and line cooks cast wary glances his way, whispering among themselves, some clearly hoping he'd fail. In the corner, one of the younger line cooks, Mateo, approached him with a small smile. "He really put you in the spotlight, huh?" he said quietly, with a trace of sympathy. "Seems that way," Landon replied with a shrug, masking his anxiety. Mateo hesitated, then offered, "If you need help, just let me know." "This place, well, I know how it can be." Landon felt a surge of gratitude. He'd been alone in this fight for so long, and this small gesture felt like a lifeline. "Thanks, Mateo. I might just take you up on that." Together, they reviewed the menu and prepped the dishes, working seamlessly through the day, with Mateo offering tips and support. Landon's confidence grew with each completed dish, each garnish placed with precision. By the time the evening approached, Landon was ready. He could feel the weight of his grandfather's legacy, but also the strength it gave him. He wasn't just cooking to prove himself to Chef Robert. He was cooking for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. As guests arrived, the restaurant buzzed with excitement. Landon's hands shook slightly as he arranged the first dish, a smoked salmon tartare with microgreens and a citrus glaze. It was delicate, refined, a dish he knew his grandfather would be proud of. One by one, the plates went out, each greeted with impressed murmurs and nods from the guests. Landon felt a wave of relief wash over him each time a server returned with an empty plate and a smile. But Chef Robert was watching, his gaze fixed on every move Landon made. With each successful dish, Robert's expression grew darker, his eyes narrowing as he saw his test backfire. The guests were raving, and Landon was proving exactly what he was capable of. As the main courses were being served, one of the servers approached the kitchen with an unexpected message. The special guest, Mr. Blackwood, he's asking for Landon at his table. Landon felt his heart skip a beat. His grandfather was here again, watching, and now he wanted a word. Chef Robert's expression soured, but he gave a curt nod. "Go on," he said through gritted teeth. "Let's see if he has anything to say about your work." Landon took a deep breath as he approached his grandfather's table, filled with a mix of nerves and pride. His grandfather, elegant in a tailored suit, looked up with a smile that was both proud and knowing. "Landon," he greeted warmly, gesturing for him to sit. "You've done well tonight." "Thank you, Grandpa," Landon replied, feeling a swell of emotions. They spoke quietly for a few minutes, his grandfather's words of encouragement steadying him, reinforcing his commitment to the craft he loved. Finally, his grandfather leaned in, his voice low but firm. "Remember, Landon, you belong here, not because of me, but because of your own talent. No one can take that from you." Landon nodded, his determination stronger than ever. When Landon returned to the kitchen, he could see Chef Robert waiting, arms crossed, clearly displeased. "Nice little family moment," he sneered. "Glad to see your grandfather's presence boosted your confidence?" Landon met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "It's not just about confidence, Chef. It's about being given the chance to prove myself, something everyone deserves." Chef Robert scoffed. "You think this place runs on chances and fairness? No, it runs on skill, on toughness, on who can take the heat. So far, you haven't shown you have what it takes to stay in my kitchen long term." Landon took a deep breath, holding back the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. He had proven himself tonight, and he wasn't going to let Robert's disdain ruin it. "I know what I bring to this kitchen," Landon replied firmly. "I'm not here for special treatment. I'm here because I earned my place." Robert's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a familiar voice interrupted them. "You're absolutely right, Landon. You have earned your place." They both turned to see Landon's grandfather standing at the doorway, his gaze fixed intently on Robert. There was a steely determination in his eyes, the kind that came from years of fighting battles in a world that often resisted change. A week after the tasting event, Landon's name was spreading fast. Articles appeared in local magazines, customers requested him specifically, and more people were beginning to recognize his talent. But with the growing attention came an even greater strain with Chef Robert, who seemed unable to hide his resentment. Their relationship, tense from the start, had deteriorated further after Landon's grandfather's unexpected support. One evening, after service, Chef Robert called Landon into his office. Landon entered, already sensing this wasn't a simple end-of-shift meeting. Chef Robert was seated behind his desk, his gaze cold, his mouth a thin line. "Close the door," Robert said, barely looking up. Landon shut the door quietly, standing tall, ready for whatever was about to happen. "I've been watching you," Robert began, his voice low and controlled. "Your work, the attention you're getting, the disruption it's causing in this kitchen. It's a problem." Landon clenched his fist, but he held his composure. "With respect, Chef, the attention isn't because of disruption. It's because of the work I'm doing, the work you hired me for." Chef Robert's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Work I hired you for? You think this is your restaurant now? You think you have the right to undermine my authority because your grandfather paid us a visit?" Landon's jaw tightened. He hadn't tried to undermine anyone. He'd only done his best, tried to prove his worth. I've done nothing but my job here. If that's a problem for you, then maybe this isn't about me. Chef Robert's face reddened. Watch your tone, Landon. You're here because I allowed it, but make no mistake. I could have you replaced in a second. There it was, the unspoken threat Landon had felt from the beginning. The threat that if he didn't play by the chef's rules, he could be pushed out without a second thought. And yet standing there, Landon realized he wasn't afraid. If he let Robert intimidate him now, he'd be letting down everyone who had ever believed in him, especially his grandfather. If you don't want me here, then say it, Landon said firmly, meeting the chef's gaze head-on. But if you think I'm going to apologize for proving myself or for the recognition I'm earning, you're mistaken. Robert stared at him, clearly unprepared for this resistance. For a long moment, the two locked eyes, the silence heavy. Finally, Robert looked away, muttering under his breath. You're excused, he said, dismissively waving a hand. Go home. Landon left the office, feeling a sense of both relief and a strange finality. He knew something had changed, that he was on the brink of a decision that would shape his future. The following morning, Landon's grandfather called him with an offer he hadn't expected. I've been speaking to a few old friends, his grandfather said, his voice warm and steady. They're interested in investing in something new, something bold. They've heard about you, Landon. They want to help you start your own place. Landon's mind spun. His own restaurant? It was a dream he'd never dared to believe could come so soon. But now, with his grandfather's support and the validation he'd earned at La Maison Étoilée, the possibility was real. But, his grandfather continued, if you accept, it won't be easy. You'll have to build everything from scratch, build your own reputation, your own standards. Landon felt a surge of excitement and purpose. I'm ready, Grandpa. I've spent too long proving myself to others who can't see past their own prejudices. It's time I built something of my own. With his grandfather's guidance, Landon began working on plans for his own restaurant, a space where everyone would be welcome, where talent and passion would be the only standards that mattered. On his last day at La Maison Étoilée, Landon approached Chef Robert with his decision. I wanted to let you know I'm leaving, Landon said, his voice calm but resolute. Chef Robert barely looked up, feigning indifference. Fine. Good luck finding another place that will tolerate your attitude. Landon smiled, unfazed. Actually, I won't be looking for another place. I'll be opening my own restaurant. Robert's head snapped up, surprise flashing across his face. You? Open a restaurant? Yes, with investors who believe in my vision, people who support me. Landon's voice was strong, each word a testament to the journey he had fought so hard for. And unlike here, we'll value everyone's contributions. Chef Robert scoffed, attempting to mask his shock. Running a kitchen is harder than you think. You'll be back here in a few months, asking for another chance. We'll see, Landon replied with a confident smile. But even if it takes years, I'll never come back here. I don't need permission to succeed. 6 months later, Landon's restaurant Roots opened its doors. It was a modest place, not flashy but filled with character and history. Landon had designed it to feel like home, with an open kitchen where diners could see the chefs at work. He hired a diverse team, offering opportunities to those who had been overlooked, creating a space where talent and heart mattered more than anything else. On opening night, his grandfather stood by his side, beaming with pride as guests filed in, eager to experience something new. Landon saw familiar faces from his time at La Maison Étoilée, diners who had come to see what he'd created and to support his new endeavor. As the night progressed, Landon looked around, taking in the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the joyful conversations. He had done it. He had built something of his own, a place where everyone, from the cooks to the servers to the guests, was seen and valued. Standing beside his grandfather, Landon felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His journey had been hard, filled with obstacles and moments of doubt, but he had proven that he didn't need to conform to anyone's narrow vision. He had forged his own path, turning his struggle into something beautiful. And as he looked around at his team, his family, and the guests who had come to celebrate, he knew that his legacy had only just begun.